Hello, everybody, and welcome to a workday Hoeg Postmortem here on Marvel Studios' Disney Plus TV adventure Loki. Hopefully you are all hearing me right now. If you could let me know somewhere in the chat, I always appreciate getting that information. We're starting a couple minutes early, so hopefully we can get started on time talking about all things Loki and MCU, honestly, because this show wound up having what appears to be some changes of some significance to the MCU as part of this. I've got a few things to say, as you might expect from my calling this video a post-mortem, and I will do that at the top of this, but I'll also be taking questions and having a discussion. That's part of why I do these post-mortems live on a more frequent basis at this point, because I like to hear from you all what you think. Before we get started, I will point out that there are going to be a ton of spoilers, I would assume, in this discussion. I'm not going to be holding any back, certainly. We're going to be talking about everything that occurred in this series. We'll also be talking a little bit about Endgame, everything that occurred in the MCU. The only thing I am not caught up on is Black Widow, because I don't pay the Disney Plus $30 premium fee. I get the movie when it's available on digital somewhere else, so I'll be a month late to that particular party, so I don't have that bit of information. My apologies. I am, however, completely caught up on WandaVision, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and Loki. And I could tell you before we even get started that Loki, to me, is probably the best of those, he says questioningly, primarily because I really enjoyed the start of WandaVision, as you might remember if you watched my postmortem on that show, and I really very much did not enjoy Falcon and the Winter Soldier, so much so that I didn't do a postmortem because, frankly, I didn't want to add that level of negativity to the world. So one thing that you can take from this video existing is that I liked Loki more than Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and more than whatever that minimum threshold is that even I, as a corporate lawyer, has to not adding negativity into the world. So without further ado, let's talk about Loki. Now, I'm a big fan of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think most of you know that. I haven't enjoyed WandaVision, especially at the end in Falcon and the Winter Soldier, as much as I would have liked. But Loki holds a special place in my heart as a character. Loki was the first villain in the Avengers. He was used to establish the threat of Thanos in Infinity War through his death at the beginning. And frankly, in the middle of Endgame, his departure and disappearance by picking up the Tesseract and just zipping off to nowhere was one of those things where I understand it when you're setting up a universe, when you're doing what Marvel has done and really trying to establish all these multi-threaded connections between your movies and now your television shows. But I have to admit, just like in Age of Ultron when Thor wanders off to talk about Ragnarok, there is a certain part of me that looks at some of these things, like Loki picking up the Tesseract in Endgame, and says, yeah, I get the commercial enterprise, but that makes this particular unified thing, in that case Endgame, a little less than, because you just have this thread to nowhere as far as that story goes, and you don't pick it up until the next TV series. But that's neither here nor there, because the TV series could be awesome, and in fact there are some interesting thoughts in this series. I just think they suffer in execution. So let's talk about why. First of all, we start with our friend Loki. Loki is picked up, as we discussed, in Endgame, but not from the year that Endgame released, instead from 2012, during the Avengers time heist, which means that this Loki in front of you is actually supposed to be, personality-wise, in the space of being the Avengers' leading villain, right? The guy that took out an eyeball, the guy that looked with glee at people kneeling before him for his glorious purpose with the big horns and everything else. That kind of villain that was mocking Black Widow from inside his cell because of the plans that he had, and that was acting with Thanos and the alien invasion to take over and to beat the Avengers and to do everything else. Well, this character, unfortunately for purposes of this TV show, has to become someone that you want to follow as a partial protagonist for the bulk, and it has to happen very, very quickly. So one of the things that happens in the very first episode is Loki's picked up by a group called the Temporal Variance Authority, or Time Variance Authority. I apologize. I like to say temporal because I really enjoyed the Journeyman Project from the 1990s. If you get that reference, leave a comment. But the Time Variance Authority is in charge of making sure that the quote-unquote sacred timeline, the timeline that we know from the MCU, doesn't get adjusted, doesn't branch off so much that it creates a nexus event, a multiverse war, as described in the cartoon that we see at the very beginning of this show. And we'll come back to this kind of war concept and multiverse concept because it's very important when we get to the end stages, the episode that was released today, and why we're doing this post-mortem now. So he's introduced to the Time Variance Authority, says, hey, you weren't supposed to pick up that Tesseract. We've got problems with branching timelines, and so we are going to interrogate you because we've also got another problem, which is that some other, as it turns out, Loki is killing folks in the Time Variance Authority, and we might just wind up needing your help, which sounds like an interesting premise for a show, but it's a premise that is pretty short-lived. At the same time that he is introduced to the Time Variance Authority, we're also introduced to one of the main co-characters in this show out of really three, and that is Owen Wilson's Mobius. Now, I think Owen Wilson and Mobius get a lot of credit for a character that mostly, in my opinion, isn't on the screen. He's kind of affable, he's a little bit snarky, he doesn't take a lot of crap from Loki, but a lot of that seems to be Owen Wilson himself. Owen Wilson's a charismatic movie star level actor, and in a lot of the things that he appears in, he kind of gives off this same vibe that he brings to Mobius. And that's good because Tom Hiddleston's a fantastic actor, and you need somebody that can bounce off him, and Owen Wilson does a pretty good job. But one of the things the show is going to try to do in its later episodes is it's going to try to pay off this relationship with heartfelt hugs and moments of grandeur and big music. And it's worth noting that Mobius and Loki don't actually spend a ton of time together, and don't actually spend a ton of time together where they're talking about anything of real significance. Somebody that's defending Loki as a show, and I don't think Loki's just for the bin, I don't think it's just terrible on its whole, might say, well, they're trying to establish Loki's character beats. A lot of episode 1, a lot of episode 2 are really focused around Mobius and Loki talking to each other and diving into what makes a Loki a Loki. Is it backstabbing? Is it lust for power? Is it untrustworthiness? Does he just like hurting people? And Mobius tries to dive into this. One, because as we said at the top of this discussion, the MCU and Marvel needs to establish Loki as someone that you can root for in some respect, even though technically he isn't the Loki that has experienced the events of the Dark World, hasn't experienced Ragnarok or his death in Infinity War. So he isn't actually the Loki that we've seen take a character arc that gets you to something like a quasi-protagonist, anti-hero type figure. So they have to warp through this all very fast and with what I would describe as expository dialogue. One of the other issues that I have with this show, and it was writ large today as we watched the finale, is that so much of it is essentially people sitting around talking about problems in the universe, talking about characters, exemplifying what my character is, no, what your character is. What do you really want to be? What were you before? And Mobius and Loki do this at length. This is actually a cut from a scene where they're sitting at a desk and they just go from headshot to headshot to headshot to headshot to headshot to headshot until finally Mobius starts showing Loki his home movies. And Loki is brought to where we know him from the beginning of Infinity War, basically by watching all of the events that actually occurred to his person in a different timeline / universe / we're not really going to worry about the time mechanics here because I don't really think they make a ton of sense. And we'll talk a little bit about why I love time travel stories towards the end of this analysis. But they don't make a lot of sense, so we're not going to waste a lot of our time. We're just going to assume it's essentially timey-wimey, if you're familiar with Doctor Who and that vernacular, and it mostly kind of makes sense in the moment and doesn't make sense if you break it down for any length of time. But suffice it to say, he watches his home movies from the MCU and comes to an understanding, has a breakdown. Tom Hiddleston acts the heck out of these kinds of scenes with that kind of internal growth and realization, but it kind of skips ahead. And more importantly, for what I was talking about just now, it skips ahead in a way that isn't terribly interesting cinematically in terms of a visual medium. When you're going to have a show that is reliant on people sitting around a table talking, you really need snappy writing, really fantastic writing, and you need direction that's going to do something with people sitting around a table talking. And unfortunately, Loki just comes up short. And you might not feel this, you might not care about this, and I'm not going to begrudge you if you don't, but watching it, you get a sense of kind of malaise or being stuck in the muck and a low energy kind of feel to all of this. One, because of that, because they're going from close up to close up to close up to close up to close up for 10, 15, sometimes 20 minutes, and without any real kind of energy in the camera work. Also, because the writing isn't that snappy, it's mostly expository, talking about how a character feels or outside the universe and things like that. And as you can see on these screens that we've already gone over, the cinematography here, the visual direction outside of, cartoons, is what I would call murky or dim. What they have really tried to achieve here, and by all means, every artist should try to achieve what they want to with whatever art they're producing, is this kind of murky dimness that nobody seems to have a light on. There certainly don't appear to be overhead lights that shed a lot of light on any given situation. And when you combine that with expository dialogue of two people sitting around a table, and then add to that we're really going to be warp speeding through important plot points to try to get characters to where they need to be in a kind of puppet master scenario, well, let's say the show starts out interesting to me. I really do like that cartoon where they're talking about the multiverse and everything else. The Time Variance Authority is interesting insofar as it presents a kind of almost Brazil-type bureaucracy towards the end of time and time travel that is interesting. They have all this kind of old flavored tech, but it just doesn't have a ton of energy. So when episode 2 kind of rolls around and we're thrust into the mystery of it all, I, at least, am already on kind of my back foot saying, wow, I had hoped there would be more energy, more excitement, more interest, more mystery in the first episode of Loki than there turned out to be because of some directions that the show decided to take. Which leads us to episode 2, where, after being enlisted by Mobius to help find this other Loki that is killing Time Variance Authority members, Loki comes upon a realization. This is after a couple more meetings of the minds where they talk about free will and they talk about other things, because part of the Time Variance Authority's ambit is that the timekeepers, these three kind of alien entities, are the ones that maintain and control the sacred timeline, tell folks apparently where it's going to go, where branches should be pruned, and help manage the Time Variance Authority, to which Loki, as a normal character, as a heroic character in most of these kinds of things, says, well, that can't possibly be. We have free will. What I decide is what I decide. It can't be at the behest of some alien lizard monsters. And from that framing, in both episode 1 and episode 2, I think you're supposed to take the pose that that's basically right. Loki isn't just the god of mischief. He's also kind of an incarnation of that free will kind of aspect of doing things outside of authority, anti-authoritarianism, sure, but especially when we're talking about aliens that are apparently controlling everyone's destiny simultaneously. So you get that, and then he's brought in by Mobius to help solve this problem of what Loki originally determines is another Loki that seeks to take over the Time Variance Authority. And he discovers that what the Time Variance Authority actually does to track potential variants is figure out where branches happen and then go there and solve whatever the variance might be. And because of that, he analyzes and determines that when you are right before an apocalypse, here on your screen, Pompeii, then you aren't going to be able to branch much. You're not going to be able to affect much. And so you could actually hide out in the shadow of apocalypses doing whatever it is that you're doing to make your plans, and that the Loki that they are searching for must be in an apocalypse. Now, keep in mind that particular plot point because it's going to become odd in just a couple of episodes, but it's pretty smart right then. It's kind of clever. I like that. Hey, if they track by branches, where can there not be branches? Maybe in the midst of apocalypses where everybody's going to die anyway. That's a nice, clever little beat. And while it does kind of ring of Doctor Who to show up at all these various apocalypses, it is still interesting. And I think that's one of my favorite little beats at the start. Now, towards the end, when they determine which apocalypse this particular Loki is hiding out at, they discover the Loki in question. Only that Loki is a lady, and a lady that goes by the name of Sylvie. Now, Sylvie is going to be your other main character, really taking the reins away from Mobius for the most part. Mobius isn't going to be, as far as I can see, very important to the rest of the plots in the show, and Sylvie, instead, is going to be the foil for Loki. Now, here's where we have one of the problems that I have with this particular story, and that is that Sylvie is supposed to be an alternate universe Loki. She has different experiences, and so she is a different person, and that's all well and good. But when I look at Sylvie and her interactions with Loki, and they're very, very important for what it turns out to be the entirety of the story of this series, I don't see another Loki. The fun of a time travel story to me, especially a multiverse kind of time travel story to me, is going and seeing these alternative versions of oneself, going to see small modifications, going to pick up what small change can result in this big change. And unfortunately, when Endgame came out, the MCU kind of threw all that away. If you remember in Endgame, a lot of people start talking about whether or not it's like Back to the Future, and you can have those kinds of scenarios, and they say, no, Endgame is not like that. MCU time travel is really kind of side multiverse travel, where you just pop into a different place that bears a likeness to the time that you experience, but you can change things, and it's not going to affect your future in your original timeline. So it really is a multiverse, even from the start of Endgame, which might make you question the premise of Loki entirely, but like the rest, we'll get back to that. So what you've got instead of kind of small changes and time travel as we know it is a time travel where you've got a Loki here and Sylvie that's just a completely different character. I don't pick up on mannerisms. I don't pick up on shared likeness of thought really at all. Maybe that's because, as we later find out in the series, Sylvie was picked up by the Time Variance Authority very, very young and apparently doing nothing to bother anybody, just picked up because she was identified as a variant by the TVA. And as a result, where there could have been a crackle to this plot line of having Loki really interacting with Loki, I find myself just looking at another person. And so you don't get what I think was supposed to be a really interesting kind of interaction. And one imagines what this would look like if they had had Tom Hiddleston actually in the role bouncing off himself throughout all of this stuff. Now, I think Sylvie is a fine actress. I don't know her name. And I think she does a fine job with what she's given in terms of writing. And I don't have a problem necessarily with the scenes that she is in. But I do think there's a lost opportunity of really having parallel worlds and parallel interactions between Lokis that left me wanting more, especially when you get to episode 3, which I think is the real nadir of the series. Episode 3 is an absolute slog where someone is trying to establish these two personalities while they walk through a purple planet that has roughly the CGI and special effects resonance of mid-1990s video games. Now, if you can name this video game, leave a comment and you deserve a prize. But it really does wind up looking like the games that I had played when I was a youth. And unfortunately, that takes away from a lot from me, but also the actual conversations that Loki and Sylvie have on this planet are nonsensical to the point of making the entire episode feel like filler, going so far as making one of the really big writing faults that I ever see in one of these, where they're on the train and they're having a conversation and they say basically, well, anyway, how about love? And it's just not organic. It's not very interesting. It's clear that the writers are moving things around puppet master style. And here's where the show really started to lose me. Now, fortunately, after this, the show started to get me a little bit back. So now we're in episode 4. We're more than halfway through the series. And when these folks are picked up in episode 4, two things happen. One, we get one of those first really weird plot holes, question mark. Now, one of the things that happens at the end, and this is one of the bigger spoilers of this series, is that they actually come out and say that Loki will return in season 2. So what you're actually watching, instead of a complete story of 6 episodes, as you might have thought when you originally tuned in, is a much more normalized television series where you've got plot holes and people doing things that aren't explained and cliffhangers at the end. So maybe this isn't a plot hole, but one of the reasons that they can even escape that planet that they're on, the purple planet eaters that's getting hit by a moon, is that they touch hands and a branch is shown on the timeline and the TVA can find that branch and take them out of the planet that they are on. But owing to what we learned in earlier episodes, that doesn't make a ton of sense on its own. If you can hide out in an apocalypse because everybody's going to die and there aren't going to be any branches, it's unclear why the two of them would have a branch, but for the fact that the TVA actually saves them, which leads you into Paradox Land. If they don't get them, they're going to be hit by a moon, so there couldn't be a branch timeline, but they do get them, so they aren't hit by a moon, so there is a branch timeline. So the branch shows because in Minority Report style, the timeline computer is guessing at these things. Really, bake your noodle, as they used to say in The Matrix, and we'll come back to that as well. But by the time you get into the bulk of episode 4, people are realizing things. Sylvie has determined that the people at the Time Variance Authority are not in fact clones as they had been told, but human being variants that have been pulled from various timelines to serve the TVA masters, which they thought was the timekeepers at the time. Upon this realization and reveal from Loki and Sylvie to the folks working at the TVA, Mobius turns on them and says, we need to get to the bottom of this, figure this all out. and they have a fight with the timekeepers. The timekeepers turn out to be robots to some other, presumably nefarious leader. And episode 4 ends where it began, really, with everybody on an understanding of what is happening, but with Loki and Mobius, and soon to be Sylvie, pruned, sent to what we thought was ultimate destruction, but actually turns out to be a place at the end of time, where they find that they are not the only people there. In fact, there are a number of other Lokis, including Old Loki, Kid Loki, Alligator Loki, and I don't actually know the Paladin Loki's name with the giant kind of Thor hammer on the other side. Before we get there, though, it's important to kind of backstep a bit to talk about episode 4, because in terms of plot, this show is just not great, right? The thing that really leads to all of this happening is a guard at the TVA by the name of B-15 having it revealed to her that there are human beings at the core of this whole variant kind of concept, as Mobius was as well. This is information that Sylvie had from the beginning, that Sylvie knew because she can enchant people, which will come up again, although I couldn't tell you why, in all honesty. And she can enchant people, and she enchants someone to look into their past, tells Loki about it, this information gets out, and it's really what drives this major action and information at the Time Variance Authority. But Sylvie has always had the goal, not of taking over the Time Variance Authority, but of ending it, to realize the free will that she thinks was stolen from her as a child. And you look at this show on the whole, and you say, what did Loki, our Loki, add to any of this? Sylvie had that information. She could have shared it. She could have done something else other than what she was doing. Loki didn't really change that in her. He just happened to be the one that came upon the information that wound up being the sole source of everything that happened here. Now, is that the branch that's identified on the planet? I couldn't tell you because the show isn't interested in these kinds of details. Maybe they will be in season 2, but for right now, you're left with so many more plot holes than answers that it can drive you crazy if you try to follow a story or a narrative like I do. And so I have to put it away, put it in the desk, and just try to enjoy what's on the screen in front of me. And this fight is fun, although it has the kind of typical MCU fight problem. Somebody shows up and gets a long time, maybe 20 seconds to say a spiel while the other folks could have been killed. It's a whole thing. But when Loki gets pruned, when Mobius gets pruned, finds himself at the end of time here, this is an episode where I really diverge from what I think the internet thinks. And that doesn't mean that I'm right, doesn't mean the internet's right. Every reasonable mind can differ on these things. Your mileage may vary. But in this particular episode, what you get is an adventure with Loki, with Sylvie, with the other Lokis, with Mobius, in a van, and of course, a giant, terrifying space dog made of clouds that eats time and space. And ultimately, what you get, to my mind, is a filler episode. You get some nice character beats with some of these folks, particularly Old Loki, who does a fantastic job. And unlike Sylvie, actually does kind of have some mannerisms of the Loki as we know him. And that results in, I think, something of a better kind of narrative than just Loki interacting with Sylvie. But you mostly get to a place where if we really think about it, and we think of Loki being pruned and Sylvie pruning herself and Mobius getting pruned, and if they had just woken up, spoiler, at the top of this castle, which starts episode 6, I don't know that a whole lot would have been removed from the story here. This is added. This is material that seems to be solely for the purpose of allowing a big scene, Guardians of the Galaxy style, where Loki and Sylvie can enchant this giant cloud space dog in order to have some big music and some big events that wouldn't otherwise be a part of the series at all. Because without episode 5, you had talking in a room in episode 4. You had some bad drama in episode 3. You had talking in episode 2 and talking in episode 1. Surprise, we'll finish the series in episode 6 with more talking than any of those episodes. And so if you're looking at this as a studio head, you say, you know what we need? We need a cloud, space, and time-eating dog. And I can understand how they got there, but as someone that likes to follow a story from its beginning to its end, it just didn't work for me, even though some bits were cool. Now, talking about plot issues, again, why in the world does enchanting the space dog actually help things? How does Loki learn to enchant when Sylvie just tells him, well, you already know how? How does enchanting the space dog open up a rift into a castle at the end of time? These are just things you have to accept as comic book notions, and I don't really have a problem suspending my disbelief for comic books, but if you stretch it too far, that suspension can only last so much. And so I look at this and I say, well, that was fun, but it didn't really add to the story. I'm glad they weren't just sitting around talking at desks, but what actually happened, which leads us to the grand finale. This is where in the prior shows in the MCU, whether it was Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which announced the new Captain America, or WandaVision, which established that Wanda was going to be off in the mountains somewhere and that there would be a new Vision when the movies pick up again, this is the thesis statement for this season. This is what the MCU was aimed at. This is what they are hoping that you take away to lead into the next thing that they want to sell you. And indeed, that is in fact the case. If you go and you look at this, when they get into the castle, they meet with the one who remains, who I don't think actually uses this name, but is some version of Kang the Conqueror, which, and again, I apologize, I'm not a big comic book guy. I do enjoy the MCU, but I know Kang from things like the board and card games that I play, is some kind of Ultra Avengers level villain that can travel in time and has apparently some cool time stories. So he is the one behind the TVA, and he spends, out of a 38-minute running time in the finale, 15 plus minutes explaining the multiverse to our heroes and explaining how, I believe it's the 31st century him came up with an understanding of multiple universes coexisting at once, and then as it turned out, multiple versions of him went to war, and that he sits here pruning and running the TVA in the sacred timeline to prevent other versions from himself from going into a multiverse war, and that Loki and Sylvie are free to do what they will, either take over the TVA or kill him, but if they kill him, there will be more Kangs to come. And that's the ultimate kind of end game status for this particular series, is what are our protagonists, Sylvie and Loki, going to do? Loki and Sylvie had come to an understanding in the prior episodes that they wanted to fight for free will. You heard that from Loki from the very beginning. You heard that from Sylvie as the show went on. And they now sit in front of the very dictator that is controlling that will, and they have a decision to make, because he says, I'm the one controlling things, and if you get rid of me, worse things are to come. If you're familiar with Marvel's Spider-Man game that Insomniac put out there, this is actually the opening premise of that game, where you're dealing with Wilson Fisk in the very first scene of that game as Spider-Man, and he basically tells you, if you put me away, there's much worse stuff that's going to come out and take over the city. And in fact, that isn't what happens entirely. But Kang here appears to be our Phase 4 villain. So many props to MCU folks for apparently putting the Phase 4 villain with a spotlight in a 6-episode Disney Plus show. I think that's a good thing. But what happens from here is a little bit odd. Now, I already told you about the 15 minutes of exposition. It's worth noting that at the end of the day, spending 15 minutes of exposition seems like it should illuminate something new. And outside of this particular individual being the person behind the thing, everything that we were told in this cartoon seems to be exactly what was happening. From episode 1, Loki is faced with a cartoon and a tiny cartoon clock that says, we keep the sacred timeline to keep the multiverse from going to war with each other. If we don't do that, it'll be a multiverse of madness, which of course is the name of the new Doctor Strange movie. And so that's why we do what we do. And that's what Loki and Sylvie have been fighting against this entire time. And yet there's a break between them as they start to discuss what's happening here. And in fact, that break is that Sylvie wants to kill Kang here because she wants free will, regardless of what happens. And Loki is the one that changes his mind, despite really having no indication that that might be the case through the rest of the series. Loki says, look, if we kill this guy and worse is to come, then that could be a problem. Sylvie immediately assumes that Loki is just seeking power, that Loki is always seeking power. Loki says no, and has what appears to be a heartfelt apology / plea to Sylvie to not do this. But at the end of the day, you're looking at characters and a character study, ideally, for something that's a lot about talking in rooms. And I don't have a great feeling for why our Loki does what he does, why he decides in that moment, even when faced with the woman that he loves, we'll talk about that in just a second, and says, no, I'd rather have security than liberty, even though this person sitting in front of me has lied throughout about how everything operates and that there weren't any timekeepers, those were robots, and the TVA isn't clones, they're variants. And that even though he's lied about so many things, I still think we should believe him because I'm risk averse now, which is not a Loki characteristic. And that risk aversion is saying, hey, don't kill him right now, Sylvie. And how does Sylvie get to the killing blow? Well, she winds up kissing him. Now, this is a little bit odd because I've skipped it as we've talked about this series, but Loki and Sylvie are the same person in different dimensions, and yet Disney decides to run their plotline as effectively romantic from the middle of the series on, culminating in what is a kiss and then a backstabbing move that actually does remind one of Loki, and Loki, our Loki, being thrown back to the TVA for the grand finale. Now, Disney has a bit of a history in uncomfortable kisses, mostly in one of my favorite series of all time, at least before Disney's ownership, Star Wars, culminating, of course, in The Rise of Skywalker and the Reylo kiss between series protagonist Rey and Dark Lord of the Sith, turned maybe not so dark, Kylo Ren. And so this isn't that unusual for them, but it is off-putting. These are the same person. There is a vibe here, which I didn't find terribly pleasant. If you've played Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, which came out this summer, you know that they have the same kind of concept, a multi-dimensional, gender-swapped version of your protagonist. And you know what Insomniac doesn't have it played romantically, because I think there's an inherent understanding that that's icky. And yet, here in Loki, it's not treated as icky. This is given a nice culmination song, and ultimately Sylvie kills Kang. Kang says, see you soon. The branches of the timeline start branching off. Loki is thrown back to the Temporal Variance Authority, or Time Variance Authority, and he comes back. Everything's fine, except Mobius doesn't remember him, and the statues of the Timekeepers have been replaced with a statue of Kang, Planet of the Apes style. Cut to credits, and I sit there going, well, that didn't answer much of anything. That felt a lot more like a season finale rather than a series finale, and lo and behold, the after credit sequence says, see ya in season 2. One of the other reasons it felt like that is because another minor character in the show, whose name I can't remember, but who I referred to as the Judge, received some information, presumably from Kang and Miss Minutes, the cartoon clock, that said, hey, go somewhere else, find some other information. She left in a very season finale kind of way, and we never found out where she was going or what that was all about. Which leaves us at the end of Loki, a series that tried to be interesting, that I felt had pretty poor writing in terms of characterization, that was underwritten for what they wanted to get to in terms of getting to this moment, in terms of getting to the moment where Loki hugs Mobius in front of the space dog a couple of episodes ago, in terms of getting at the heart of these characters. Now, I do think some of that's a function of what they tried to achieve by actually having to make this character somebody new in the space of one episode. You never got a great feel for who this Loki from 2012 through the TVA and into this relationship with Sylvie and Mobius actually was, in a way that I felt was terribly insightful or compelling. And that leaves you really reliant on snappy writing, insightful direction, and a lot of things that have been missing throughout the MCU Disney Plus experiment. And I don't really want to begrudge any aspect of this, because it's clear that Marvel and Disney take a heavy thumb to the creation of these MCU materials, really determine a lot of what's going on. In a lot of respects, the writers and the directors are caretakers of what Kevin Feige and Marvel and Disney put out there. But in this particular respect, I do think 6 episodes felt both way too fast and way too slow when you're having 20 minutes of expository dialogue at a time. And you get to a place where it feels like you're having a series finale for something that ran for 5 years, and all these characters know and love each other, and the betrayals are important. And to me, they just aren't. So what you get at the real end of the day is not so much a glorious purpose as much as a purpose to act as a commercial for what's going to be Phase 4 and your Phase 4 villain, and maybe get more butts in the seats for Spider-Man and Doctor Strange and Ant-Man and all the rest. So while I'd really like to have enjoyed Loki more than I did, while I have a lot of love for the character and a lot of love for the MCU, unfortunately for me, that's just not what wound up happening with this series. Not as bad as Falcon and the Winter Soldier by far. Maybe not as good as the opening couple of episodes to WandaVision, but still overall a disappointment for a character and a series that I really love a whole lot. So, That's my analysis of Loki. That's the Hoeg Law postmortem version of things. If you want to get my attention, happy to talk to you, ask questions. At Hoeg Law gets my name up in the chat. You can also, of course, super chat me, but that is not at all required. And if you have your own thoughts, I'll take a look at some of these comments as I went through my analysis. But please do ask the questions. I want to have these conversations because I think it's very interesting. I think Loki is one of those shows that's almost annoyingly close to good or even great, but doesn't get anywhere near it from my eye because of the way the plot develops, because of the direction, because of so much exposition. The finale is just an exposition scene, and an exposition scene that almost entirely mirrors the exposition scene that started the series in episode 1. So you add that to Loki kissing Sylvie, you add that to plots to nowhere with the TVA, and I find something that's really, really underwhelming when it could have been something so much more. Let's see here. We got to disagree with Rich, that's me, on Space Cloud Dog. Everybody loves giant nebulous space clouds. Worked great for Fantastic Four, Rise of the Silver Surfer. See, I think somebody's being a little bit sarcastic there. But yeah, I think clouds make good enemies, but much like Lost, if they don't really have a purpose or rule set, and you can just say, I'm going to enchant it, and it's going to lead to a portal to a Dragon's Lair type castle at the end of time, well, it's hard to understand the stakes of the fight in question. Let's see, at Hoeg Law, thank you for using that. Makes it easier for me to see. Kind of feels like the show ends where it begins with the same amount of unanswered questions. One thing I think you could really attach to the MCU's Disney Plus experiment here is that for the most part, they either end where they began or they end in a place where one could have assumed they would be at the end of whatever movie you last saw them in. So in Endgame, when Scarlet Witch is kind of lamenting the loss of Vision and she's looking out at the lake, you could imagine that she finds herself in a mountain studying magic when the next movie picks up. Similarly, at the end of Endgame, when Steve hands over the shield to Anthony Mackie, to Falcon, and he says, I take it, you could assume that he's going to be Captain America the next time you see him. So the fact that you had a TV series that said, oh, I doubted it, there were problems, and now I'm Captain America, does leave you in roughly the same place where you could have assumed that you would have been. Here, I suspect they're not going to be able to just skip the multiverse Kang explanation in whatever movie he might appear in. So you'll probably see that copied over again, just with the understanding that the multiverse exists and there's going to be problems. Now, I did mention when I was going through my analysis, the multiverse has really always existed as far as we knew it. In Doctor Strange, he talked about magic coming from the multiverse. In Endgame, the concept of time travel was already a multiverse. So, if anything, the beginning of Loki should have been the thing that was raising red flags because it didn't match with much of what we understood in the MCU. And as it turns out, because time operates differently, because Kang was isolating his universe, whatever that might mean, with his powers at the TVA, that when it cracks, when Sylvie kills him, I believe that should apply to all prior timelines. That's kind of how the timeline works as understood in Loki. So everybody else was already operating with kind of a multiverse concept, and that didn't really change with what happened in Loki. It's almost an origin story that happened after the fact. But again, if you think too hard about this stuff in a show like Loki, you're going to make your head spin. Let's see what else we've got here. It's funny Rich mentions episode 3 being the low point because that's where I stopped watching. I binged the last 3 today. Oh, yeah. No, I've been watching with my daughter who really loves Loki, is one of her favorite characters. And episode 3 was basically where she said, oh, that was horrible. And so we stopped. We caught up on episodes 4 and 5 the other day. And I'm probably be watching episode 6 with her later on. But yeah, episode 3 was really, really bad stuff. Hold on one second. Just getting a sip of water there. But otherwise, I think the show isn't awful. It's just inert. It's just not as good as it could be. Let's see. Holy crap, I forgot I hadn't closed this. I switched over to another tab. When I started talking, I nearly had an accident. Yeah, that can happen. Sometimes I do that with Twitch, and I forget that I'm waiting on something, and then people just pop on in. Maybe 3 and 4 could have been combined. I certainly think that 3 should have ended in the first 10 minutes of 4 when they get picked up. I don't think it made a lot of sense for there to be the planet episode and then a few minutes of a planet episode and then a TVA episode. I think you could have split those thematically a little bit better. But overall, I just think it was a bad idea. You wanted to get Loki and Sylvie in a room, talking to each other, having an interesting kind of conversation. maybe the premise of episode 3 isn't the problem as much as the writing and the conversations that actually came out of it. They weren't great. You didn't get a lot of what you would want to if you're just going to have people sitting on a train talking to one another. And unfortunately, I think that's really what holds Loki back, is you need that relationship to be important at the very end. If it worked for you, I suspect that ending works better for you, even if you had to sit and listen to Kang for 15 minutes. But if it didn't work for you, as it didn't work for me, and you're not getting any of that fun time travel stuff because the rules are so inchoate and ambiguous, then I don't know what you're hanging your hat on with respect to Loki. And Loki, of course, is just an odd character because he's a villain when he starts the show. He's not a villain by the end of episode 1. His motivations are unclear. Then they're free will. Then they're not, because this guy that lied to him admitted that he lied to him. It's just not a great kind of dissection of what in the world this person is thinking. You might say that's realistic because human beings are that way. And that might be the case, but if you're going to be realistic, then you really need to dive into a character study and talk about how those things happen and not pretend that you're telling a comic book story and understand where it is that you're actually making your show. Loki does not feel like the first Avengers version of Loki. No, he doesn't at all. That's one of your primary problems, is that you feel like Tom Hiddleston is essentially Loki from Infinity War / everything that happened at the end of Ragnarok. They try to establish that with the home movies. And if you don't buy that, you don't buy that. And you don't get some of that cool feeling of, ooh, we're watching a different dimension or we're watching a different time travel type episode here. And when you lose that and you really start to dig down into what you're actually watching, it comes up a little bit short. But that's my postmortem. It doesn't look like anybody else has any other questions, which is totally fine. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a comment to this video. This video will, of course, be up on the channel just like any other video. And leave me a comment with how you feel about things, how you feel about your favorite episodes, your least favorite episodes, whether or not you like that Sylvie kiss. Because I got to tell you, it got me a little, didn't give me good feelings when that happened. Whether you like the ending, the exposition, or whether at the end of the day, you just had bouncing time travel rules, bouncing dimensional rules, a Loki that didn't make a ton of sense, Sylvie that was pretty much driven from beginning to end, but that all wound up feeling like a commercial for a phase 4 that is now imminent and trying to get you into the movie theater to watch Doctor Strange and Ant-Man and everyone else fight what we now know is Kang. Thanks for everybody to come watch and to chat with me on this. And I'll catch you on the next postmortem. Hopefully I do a few more light things like this on the channel. God knows I need them. I've done enough lawsuits. But otherwise, we're talking about the business and law of video games, technology, pop culture, and entertainment. And I will catch you on the next Virtual Legality. Thanks so much for checking it out.